In this video, we are going to talk about muscle metabolism, how we use different substrates, different nutrients to produce ATP, and how we use different pathways to make ATP. There's a previous video called Metabolism, and if you forget the details, you can click the link in the description to refresh your memory. I will basically summarize the steps of the oxidative phosphorylation pathway that we talked about in that previous video. But first I want to look at the nutrients that we can use, that we can break down to produce energy, and then we will look at the different pathways. Up here at the top we have our major macromolecules. Our nucleic acids are the DNA and RNA, and they can be broken down into nucleotides. Proteins, we make about 100,000 proteins in our body. Actin and myosin are the main proteins in our muscles, and they are all composed of amino acids. We have about 20 different amino acids that we use to produce all the proteins in our body. We can break down muscle proteins to produce amino acids to produce energy. Our body can use nucleotides, but it's not a primary source of fuel. The main molecules that our muscles like to use to produce energy are glucose and fatty acids. In our muscles and our liver, we can store a polysaccharide called glycogen. Glycogen can be broken down to produce the monosaccharide glucose that has this C6H12O6 structure. And lipids are fats. The primary fat that we store in our adipose tissue is triglycerides, and they are composed of glycerol and fatty acids. In the previous video, we talked about fast-twitch fibers, intermediate, and slow-twitch fibers. Now, they prefer to use different substrates to make energy. Our fast-twitch fibers primarily use glucose, and they will primarily break down glycogen to make the glucose once the blood sugar glucose starts to decrease. So the fast-twitch fibers, these are the high-intensity strength, speed, power muscles, and they primarily use the anaerobic pathway. This is our glycolytic pathway where we have the byproduct of producing lactic acid. So when your muscles feel like they're burning, you're using your anaerobic pathway and making lactic acid. So fast-twitch fibers primarily use glucose and glycogen to make a little bit of ATP very quickly, but those muscles, even though they're very strong, they fatigue rapidly. Slow-twitch muscle fibers, they use the aerobic pathway, that is our oxidative phosphorylation pathway. So that's why they're called the slow oxidative fibers. And when they turn on all that machinery to start the oxidative phosphorylation pathway, they actually prefer to use fats. So we will primarily break down fatty acids, either to keep the blood sugar stable or to directly fuel the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain to make a lot of ATP. So the slow twitch aerobic fibers, they make a lot of ATP and they can last for a very long period of time. So you're going to use your slow twitch fibers primarily for endurance, and you're primarily going to break down fat. And this is why the dark meat of chicken is juicier. Slow twitch fibers store a little bit of fat. So there is always a little bit of a stored energy supply. So we can get that fat from our adipose tissue, but our slow twitch fiber muscles are going to keep some actually stored in the muscle as well. Whereas our fast twitch fibers, they are primarily going to store glycogen. So you're going to store more glycogen in your fast fibers if you do activities that are higher intensity or speed or strength kinds of activities. Now we're going to look at the three main pathways. So we talked about oxidative phosphorylation, and we talked about the glycolytic anaerobic pathway, but there's one other pathway, and that is the creatine phosphate pathway. And this is a very rapid way of producing ATP for the very first beginning part of an exercise. So we use creatine first and primarily by our fast-twitch fibers. So creatine is a molecule that is stored in the muscle fibers, and it can be phosphorylated to produce creatine phosphate. And then this phosphate can be used to directly bind to an ADP molecule so that we can produce ATP very, very quickly. So this is used primarily during the initial muscle contraction, like within the first few seconds of muscle contraction. Let's suppose you're lifting weights in the gym, then in between your sets when you are relaxing, you are going to recycle your creatine phosphate supply. Sometimes athletes use creatine phosphate as a supplement. It's really only going to be beneficial for athletes that are using fast twitch fibers, that are lifting weights or sprinting or doing high intensity exercise, because you use the creatine in the very initial first few seconds and it will give you an advantage. It will make your muscles work just a little bit harder so that when you recover, you get stronger. Creatine is not a beneficial supplement for endurance athletes. So creatine is our first pathway, and we use that initially at the very beginning of muscle contraction for the first few seconds. And then if you're lifting weights, for example, you're going to switch over into the glycolytic pathway. So I want to just quickly review our glycolysis, Krebs cycle, electron transport pathway. So during the oxidative phosphorylation pathway, we can use glucose. We can make pyruvate, that can be oxidized. We can make acetyl-CoA, goes into the Krebs cycle, goes into the electron transport chain. That whole pathway takes a period of time to turn on. All of those enzymes that are involved in all of those steps takes a little bit of time. So if you want to go for a jog, then initially that system is not going to be turned on. You need to warm up because you need to signal the muscles to get all of this stuff going, so that you may find that when you go running or cycling or doing some kind of an endurance activity, the first 5 minutes, maybe even up to 10 minutes, doesn't feel super great. You get out of breath really quickly. And that's because you're using your glycolytic pathway. You're trying to make ATP very quickly because the oxidative pathway hasn't fully turned on yet. And then once that pathway is going, then you start to feel good. Then you can make lots of ATP going through this whole oxidative process. When we are using the glycolytic pathway, we are only using the glycolysis section, and then we are producing lactic acid. But glycolysis is quicker, we make ATP quicker, but not as much. So using the glycolytic pathway, you will fatigue faster. The oxidative pathway lasts much longer, but it takes a little bit of time to get going. So we can use all of these nutrients to produce energy. But primarily, we are going to use glucose, our blood sugar, and we can break down glycogen, and we can go through oxidative phosphorylation pathway, or pyruvate can be converted into lactic acid, and that is the glycolytic pathway. And we can also use beta oxidation of fatty acids that can join the Krebs cycle. We can break down proteins as well, and this will occur if you run out of other nutrients or other nutrients become very low. In this slide, we have a summary of all three processes. I'm going to zoom in to each process. All of them will eventually make lots and lots of ATP. So first, we will zoom in here to our creatine phosphate. So our very initial immediate source of energy is creatine phosphate, and this is stored in the muscles. The phosphate can be moved to an ADP molecule to make ATP. The enzyme that is used to move this phosphate is called creatine kinase. When we are resting, we can recycle the creatine, and we can add that phosphate back. So during little rest periods, we can recycle it. So during the initial first few seconds of an exercise, especially high intensity or speed or strength exercises, you will use creatine phosphate. So now I want to focus over here on the liver. We store glycogen in our liver, and the liver can break down glycogen to produce glucose, and this helps to maintain our blood glucose level. Our brain needs to have a constant supply of glucose, so when our muscles start using the blood sugar, our body has to find ways to keep this stable. So one of those ways is to break down glycogen. This process is called glycogenolysis. When we use glycogen to increase blood sugar, that blood sugar can be used to go through the glycolysis process. Now, if that glycolysis process is the anaerobic pathway, so oxygen is not present, we're going to use our fast fibers. Glycolysis will convert glucose into pyruvate, which will be converted into lactate or lactic acid. Now, this lactic acid can go into the blood and it can be broken down by the liver. We can actually also recycle lactate, and it can join the pathway depending on changes in our activity level. So we are primarily going to break down glycogen and go through this anaerobic pathway when we are using our fast twitch muscle fibers. When we are resting, so after our exercise, then we have to restore muscle glycogen. And muscle glycogen can be restored either from eating, so after you work out, when you eat food, then any of the carbohydrates you consume will immediately start to go towards replenishing this glycogen supply. And you can also break down fat and convert it into blood sugar, which can be stored as glycogen. We also have stored fat. We store our fat in our adipose tissue, which is the subcutaneous fat underneath our skin. We can also store some visceral fat, but primarily the healthy fat is subcutaneous. When we break down fat, we produce fatty acids. These fatty acids can join the oxidative phosphorylation pathway by breaking down into acetyl-CoA and joining the Krebs cycle. When we use the Krebs cycle, we're going to produce lots of NADH molecules that will then go to the electron transport chain. And when we use the electron transport chain, we are going to produce lots of ATP. So when we are doing aerobic exercise, using our slow twitch fibers, we are going to have lots of available oxygen. This is the main pathway that we are going to use to make the most energy. And these fibers can last for the longest period of time. So we have 3 ways of making ATP: our creatine, our aerobic pathway, and our anaerobic pathway. And then in the muscles, why do we need all this ATP? First, we have to be able to bind it to myosin so that we can have that cross-bridge power stroke cycle and we can contract the muscles. And secondly, we need to be able to pump the calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. I just want to go through a list of key terms, and there's a couple other molecules that we can use to make energy. Number 1, we use creatine phosphate. This is made from amino acids in our liver, and we use creatine kinase to phosphorylate it, and we can store some in our muscles. It is our very rapid initial energy supply. Glycogenolysis, this is the process of our liver breaking down glycogen to produce glucose. There are hormones that stimulate this, so when we are fasting or exercising, we are going to produce glucagon and epinephrine when our blood sugar starts to decrease, and that will trigger the liver to break down glycogen. The muscles also store some glycogen, especially the fast twitch fibers. Lipolysis is the process of breaking down fat. This is when we use beta oxidation to produce acetyl coenzyme A that can go into the Krebs cycle. We can also convert fat or amino acids into glucose. Our liver can do this, and that process is called gluconeogenesis. And this helps to maintain blood sugar. When we break down fat as our primary fuel source, which will occur when we have periods of time when we're not eating or during aerobic exercises, especially extended long periods of aerobic exercise, then we will produce ketones. So when fat is broken down, it can be converted into ketones like acetone and hydroxybutyrate. And those molecules can be converted into acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA can also be converted into ketones. Ketones are the basis of the ketogenic diet. So sometimes people will purposely have a very low carbohydrate diet to force their body to break down fat, to use the fat as fuel. And when you do that, you have this sort of byproduct of producing ketones. And our brain can use ketones and our muscles can use ketones. Some research shows that it does help with weight loss and some research shows that it doesn't. No diet is perfect for every single person, right? So everybody has their own metabolism. Some people are better at burning carbs and some people are better at burning fat. So lactic acid can actually also be used to produce energy. So we produce lactic acid during our anaerobic glycolytic pathway, where we convert pyruvate into lactic acid, but we can also convert lactic acid back into pyruvate. So if your high intensity exercise decreases in intensity, then that lactic acid can be used to make pyruvate, and then when the intensity decreases, we can move into our aerobic pathway. And then lastly, we can use protein for fuel if other fuel sources are low. You can break down muscle tissue to make energy, and depending on the intensity of the exercise and what kind of training you're doing and how much muscle you're trying to build, we generally don't have to worry. But if you're an average person that's just working out and you break down a bit of muscle, it's fine because then your muscles will just rebuild it. But if you're training for something very specific where you need to build a lot of muscle mass, then you would need to make sure that you don't decrease your fuel supply to the point where you're going to break down too much muscle. Your body is always going to prioritize energy over conserving muscle mass. So if your glycogen and fat and blood sugar supply decreases too much, then your muscles will break down protein so it can keep making energy. So at this point, I want to just clarify when we use certain nutrients. So what's the very first thing that our muscles are going to use for energy? Creatine phosphate. Creatine is first. We use it very rapidly within the first few seconds of any activity, especially high intensity activities. What can our body use next? What's the next most rapid thing? What do you think is faster? Using the glycolytic pathway or the oxidative phosphorylation pathway? The glycolytic pathway is faster. So you're going to break down glucose, make pyruvate, make lactate, and you have ATP. The oxidative phosphorylation pathway has all those processes. You have to oxidize pyruvate, oxygen has to be available, you got to go through all the Krebs cycle electron transport chain. That takes much longer. Okay, so this is why at the beginning of an exercise, you can feel out of breath, because your whole metabolism has to still turn on. So next we will use the glycolytic pathway. Then we will start to use our oxidative phosphorylation pathway. With glycogen, we can start breaking down glycogen within about 5 minutes. So we're going to use our blood sugar as our very first supply, but then our body has to try to maintain our blood sugar. So then we have to start breaking down other things. So within about 5 minutes, you start breaking down glycogen, and depending on the intensity of your activity, glycogen supplies in the muscles and the liver generally last around 30 minutes. You will deplete it faster with higher intensity exercise. It will last longer with lower intensity exercise. And then we can start breaking down fat. It takes maybe closer to 10 minutes to start breaking down fat and triggering the beta oxidation pathways. So it takes a little bit longer to make your body go into the fat storage. Also, generally, any exercise that is going to be higher than about 65% of your maximal effort is going to primarily use glycogen. Anything lower than about 65% of your maximal effort is primarily going to use fat. So I want to talk about our basal metabolic rate. So how do we burn calories, right? So our basal metabolism is the amount of energy that we need per day to just have normal cell functions. We also burn about 10% of the calories we consume digesting food, and this is called the thermogenic effect of food. And then lastly, we can increase the amount of calories that our body requires with exercise. So what do you think burns more calories? Let's suppose you're going to do 5 kilometers. In one way, you're going to walk 5 kilometers, and let's say it takes you about an hour. And the next day, you're gonna run 5 kilometers. Let's suppose it takes you half an hour. What do you think matters more, the amount of time that you're exercising or the intensity of the exercise? In which way will you burn more calories, walking 5K or running 5K? Higher intensity exercise burns more calories, and there are 2 reasons why. So even though you're doing that exercise for less time, when you have a higher intensity exercise, you're actually going to cause more damage to your muscle fibers. So do you remember our actin and myosin, how the myosin heads bind to the actin to cause contraction? When you do higher intensity exercise with more weight or speed or force or power, you break off those myosin heads. You cause more muscle damage, which is actually a good thing because after the exercise, now your body has to rebuild. So you're not just using ATP to cause the muscle contraction, you are using ATP later to rebuild those muscles. Now, lastly, we have 2 people here. We have Betsy and we have George. And who's gonna burn more calories? Okay, so Betsy walks her little chihuahua for 20 minutes once a day. And George works out 5 times a week. Betsy's female and George is male. Betsy is older and George is younger. Betsy doesn't have a whole lot of body weight. She weighs, let's give her 112 pounds. And George, he's 180 pounds. So who is going to burn more calories? George. For all of those reasons that I just said, there are 4 main factors that affect how many calories you burn. So Betsy might only need 1,200 calories per day to maintain her body weight, whereas George might need 3,500 calories per day to maintain his body weight. So the 4 main things that affect how many calories you burn in a day are your age, your gender, how much muscle mass you have, because muscle mass, every myosin head needs an ATP for contraction, and how physically active you are. What kinds of exercise are you doing? And here is a list of reasons of why you want to make sure you are exercising on a regular basis.